When you go and you read a lot of these stories in the Old Testament, you figure out pretty quickly that morally stuff just wasn't quite the same all the time. It's a very different context. There were different expectations. I mean, this stuff is going back like pre-Bronze Age in the Old Testament, like Iron Age, practically into, I guess, what historians call the Stone Age and a primeval era. I mean, your modern sensibilities, they just don't neatly work with all of these stories. But even so, even taking that into account, when you go and look at some of these stories, it's pretty easy to be like, oh, I think I know what I'm supposed to do with that as I read it today. All of this story points to the character and consistency of God, all of the whole Bible, and all of these gross up and down anecdotes that might turn our stomach or might make us look at somebody with admiration. They all ultimately point to God, but the human examples, it's usually pretty easy. David and Goliath, well, I don't know. I've never had to go fight a giant and try to behead him before. That is something I actually hope I never have to do. But kind of the life lesson there is pretty easy, right? I don't know, be bold and courageous when your back's up against the wall and you're fighting for what's right. I'm not saying that's the point of the passage, but the moral example is pretty easy there. How about we go even further back and even further afield culturally for most of us to Joseph after he got sold into slavery in Egypt and he caught the eye of Potiphar, his master's wife, and she wanted to do stuff with him. Well, the moral example is, yeah, look at what Joseph did. He just refused to dishonor his master or himself or his wife in that way. Okay. I get the lesson here. At least there is a lesson as part of this Bible story that I can take from it. And that brings us to the passage we're at right now in Esther chapter 2. Before we move forward with the story, I just want to take one day and try to game this thing out. I don't even know where this conversation is totally going. I just want to think about it in real time with you, because I think Esther chapter 2 is very difficult in terms of a moral example. And maybe Esther chapter 2 is one of those passages that is meant to remind us that it doesn't always work like that in the Bible, that not everything that goes on and not the way everything is presented in the Bible can easily be distilled down into this would be the right thing, this would be the wrong thing to do. And so from a modern perspective, in terms of like raising your daughters or things like that, well, you hope that nothing like this would ever happen to your kids or to a girl that you love or to any human ever. And I know that in some of the dark corners of our world and our culture right now, bleak situations like this are happening. People with unchecked power throughout all of history have a robust track record of engaging in incredibly dark stuff involving sexuality. And so, okay, that part's not hard. This kind of contest isn't good and it isn't right. And I think that is an easy moral example to take from this. But most of us are never going to be the king of kings, the king of earth and water, the king of lands. And so let's just do the exercise, though. I guess we can look at Esther 2 and be like, hey, if you ever are, come on, dude, don't have a contest like this. It's in really poor taste. I think it's wrong. I think it's, even though you're in charge of the law in this hypothetical, I think it's tantamount to trafficking. I don't think it's tantamount. I think it just is. It's just wildly, deeply evil. But for the rest of us who are probably never going to be the king of anything, I mean, that lesson is just a situation that you're not going to face. So it's easier when you think about the moral example to be like, well, what should you do if you're Mordecai? What should you do if you're the attendants in this contest around the harem? What should you do if you're Esther? I don't know. I don't know enough about the situation, and the author seems to intentionally withhold details about the situation. That said, I think I can kind of triangulate how the original audience felt about it, and that is they didn't feel great about what happens in Esther chapter 2. There's smoking gun stuff in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that says don't marry somebody who's not Jewish at this point in the history of the redemptive plan. The Jewish people weren't supposed to do that. And I mean, there's not like an exception that's built in there. We're like, well, if it's a king and there's a contest, then that's okay. I mean, within the context of God and his chosen people and the ground rules of their relationship in the Old Testament, I guess technically she shouldn't have done that, I guess. But also look at all the passive voice and how much of this is happening to her. So assuming she had no choice, I guess the original audience would have just had to have viewed this as being distasteful, not like the kind of thing you can blame this kid for, I would think. But I don't know. Then I go and I look at the commentaries written about Esther by ancient theologians, Jewish, Christian, etc., and some of them do blame her. And they were like, no, you should have chosen death before you would defile yourself in front of everybody by marrying this Gentile. I mean, at the exact same time that this is going on, well, not at the exact same time, shortly after the situation in Esther, you get the second half of the events recorded in the book of Ezra, and you get the material recorded in the book of Nehemiah. And the second half of those lovely stories about rebuilding everything includes the Jews admitting that they shouldn't have gone and intermarried with all the people when they went back out of captivity. And there's this grand culture-wide, ethnic-wide divorce of all of their Gentile spouses. And those are very difficult passages to read. I mean, these are families and everything. But the religious leadership is like, hey, this is how we got into this mess in the first place. We're supposed to be a people set apart. So we have that contemporary example in Ezra and Nehemiah, and those events happened just ensuing decades after Esther. So clearly this was not something that the committed Jewish man and woman in the ancient world at this time was down with. They wouldn't have felt great about this at all. They would have viewed it as an affront to the commands of God, and they would have viewed it as something that is a travesty. But also, if you read through the rest of the book of Esther, I would think that all of the Jewish people who were alive 10, 20, 30, 40 years after this and going through the events described in Ezra and Nehemiah, well, I think they'd be okay with how it worked out, even though they still go ahead and do a gigantic marital purge, thinking that, again, this intermarriage between cultures and the adopting of little dashes of foreign gods and their kind of stuff is how they got into the mess way back in the first place that caused them to become so weak and culturally mingled with other deities that they couldn't stand up to Nebuchadnezzar and make good decisions, and God allowed the judgment of the Babylonians to come to destroy everything that was happening there in the temple and in Jerusalem. So this relationship with the nations, having an intimate relationship with a Gentile, a non-Jewish person, let alone marrying them, this was a hot button issue at the time that Esther was written and at the time that Esther holds out these events as having taken place. So I would have to imagine that for the original audience, this was not meant to be exemplary. We've got so much data to say they would have cringed at this, maybe tore clothing as this part was read. This would be a very regrettable outcome, a tragic outcome. Some would have blamed Xerxes, some would have blamed Mordecai, some would have blamed Esther, but I cannot imagine a scenario in which this would be viewed as a morally desirable situation or outcome to the original audience. Fast forward a whole bunch to a modern audience to right now, and we live in a sexually hypercharged world where we're in a very bizarre moment in the history of humankind where sex and sexuality it's a religion unto itself. There's a whole cult of it that exists worldwide. We're in a place where we've got utter chaos on this. And again, I don't say this sitting atop a throne of perfection and thinking all the right thoughts and doing all the right things. I say this as an honest observer of culture who has been touched by the mess we've made together as well. We live in a very weird time sexually. So understandably, somebody who reads through the Bible and is like, man, I want to try to live in keeping with the values of the kingdom, the value of the God behind all of this, they're going to look at the world and be like, dang, the values of the kingdom look pretty different sexually from what's going on in the larger world right now. And, maybe I need to look to the Bible for examples for how to summon strength and live in a way that is in keeping with what God's commands are about sex and sexuality and relationships and marriage and all of that stuff. And you scroll through the Bible and what you get are some good examples. Well, I guess we mentioned Joseph earlier, but you also get some really compromised examples and tricky stuff. I guess I look at this passage and I just don't see a way to gerrymander a reading out of it that makes Esther chapter 2 some kind of lovely moral example that you can really do much of anything with. I think this is more of a tragedy at this point that is setting up for a big, grand surprise reversal. I think the better way to read this is with an eye toward God. This looks very bleak. This looks very sad. Yet somehow, providentially, this is shaping up for God to work all things together for the good of those who love him. What some intended for evil, God is clearly intending for good, and we're going to get that payoff as the book goes along. But I don't think we've got this payoff yet. We've seen some good qualities from Mordecai. We've seen some good qualities from Esther. We've seen a whole bunch of things that have just kind of happened. And so in that, maybe if there's any example here, it's the example of how the human problem works. Sin, failure, brokenness. I mean, sin throughout the Bible, it's not just, I did a naughty thing. It's not just volitional, willful choosing of evil. That's in there, and everybody has done that and fallen short of the glory of God. But then there's also sin that other people do to us, and we know exactly who they were and what they did, and we did not want that, and we did not want to participate in it. But their evil choices caused the consequences of their sin to injure us, to damage our hearts, our lives, our bodies, whatever it was. But then there's also evil that happens to us that it kind of looks like nobody picked. There's nobody to really point at. It's just super bad. When the world spirals into inevitable chaos because we put too much trust in the AI digital deities that we're trying to create right now. Like, I do think we're going to get to a place where we have a reckoning with that, and our relationship with technology and artificial intelligence will break something very badly. Well, there won't be some guy to point at and be like, you did that one. That was you, Buster. It's just institutional evil. Economic injustice and suffering. Maybe there are some people that you can blame, but the world is very hard. Nature is trying to kill you all the time. And so part of the human problem is just our relationship with a broken world that maintains some elements that are reflective of the garden and of the ultimate reality described in Revelation, whereby people are made right with God and exist in the presence of God in an unbroken relationship. But in the meantime, things hurt. They hurt because we do stuff. They hurt because people do stuff to us. They hurt because we or others meant to do good, but just accidentally we're getting it wrong. And sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And some other stuff, nobody even seems to be actually responsible. It just happened because the world is broken. I think if you want a really good, clean example to get from Esther 2, it would be all of that swirling mess of brokenness is part of what we contend with. And we at least see flashes of people trying to be shrewd and do something that kind of makes sense in light of the difficult moment that they're in. But in terms of moral perfection, I don't think we can look for that in Esther chapter 2. In terms of some sort of example for how young men and young women ought to conduct themselves, man, there's plenty of stuff in the Bible that deals with that. I don't think we get that from Esther chapter 2. I also think that if the author of this book wanted to give us that, well, it's a really good book, and this is a really great author. They could have given us that. They bent over backwards to write this in a way that leaves it morally ambiguous or at least morally non-exemplary to just get us to the starting line of the problem and to allow us to get to the starting line of the problem with an acknowledgement of, oh, wow, the world is tough. We can't get out of our own way, and we can't get out of the way of it. We hurt. This is a mess. Sometimes there aren't a lot of right options in front of us. How can redemption come out of this particular situation? And then here in just a few verses that we'll look at in a couple of days, we're going to see the story pivot toward the beginning of the answer to that question. Even unnamed, God can work this ugliness that we're immersed in towards something that is redemptive and beautiful. That might not be an answer. I don't know. I didn't prepare this. I mean, I just turned on a microphone and I've just been reading this along with you and working it through with you. And those are my thoughts as I wrestle through it. Some of you might come to very different conclusions, and there's a tacit acknowledgement in all of this that the world's a pretty compromised place. And apart from God, the situations we face, mercy, they're just awfully difficult. Yet here comes redemption right around the corner. All right. Thanks for letting me just run on that a little bit. Next time around, we're going to talk about this banquet that gets thrown and how Mordecai comes back into focus moving forward. Matt, this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.